He turns and says, "We're not going to make it." I said, "We're not going to make it." What? Well, hello. We decided it's sunny. It's a couple of days after it's frozen. It's probably about 48, 50 degrees, but you can never have too many mimosas. So we're going to have a little mimosa here I'm making, but we're using the limeade raspberry mimosa with me and my friend. And
she's gonna spill the tea about the time she almost died.
oh, that. Well, you know how you go out with your friends. I said, "Okay, what are we going to do?" And they said, "Oh, go to lunch." I said, "Where are we going to lunch?" They said, "Oh, we'll surprise you." So I said, "Where are we going?" They said, "Hey, we're going to take a little plane ride." I said, "Okay, where are we going?" They said, "Well, it's a little town in Texas. We will be back today." I said, "I've got to be back." They said, "Oh, we'll be back today. Don't worry." So we go with other friends and meet at the airport. They said, "We'll go eat lunch and we'll come back." We go to the airport. We take off. It's this little Beechcraft Bonanza aircraft. And I thought, Beechcraft Bonanza, I've heard of those. I couldn't think where at that point. And so they said, "Well, let's take off." So we take off, have a smooth flight, and it's into a small town in Texas. That's what I'll say. We have a wonderful lunch and we ate, and it was simple lunch just with some friends. And I think it was 2 or 3 hours later, we get ready to take off. And the pilot, it seems like we were going, lifting, getting ready to lift. I had taken flying lessons. And so I knew that something didn't quite seem right. But I was like, nah. So the pilot turns, it's like in a slow mo thing. He turns and says, "We're not going to make it." I said, "We're not going to make it." What? That's all I knew. Sometime later, I woke up and I was hanging from my. Actually, I didn't wake up till just when I was put on the ground. Apparently, we crashed in this small plane, and it's called a V-tailed doctor killer or a fork-tailed doctor killer because so many physicians have had died in them. They don't make them anymore. Thank you very much. I said, "Well, exclude me from that." So we I woke up and I was hanging upside down. They had to cut my seatbelt, and 4 counties responded in this small town, and they were all around me. All these people were around me, and I looked around, and I think I threw up at some point, and so I thought, "Oh dear." And so I threw up. They packaged me. The pilot comes up to me. He has tears in his eyes and he says, "Oh, are you okay?" My hands went for the throat. They didn't quite reach, but they went for the throat. I'm joking, but I thought, what happened? So we're packaged up. They call me. They had a hard cervical collar on, stiff neck in those days, we called it. And I was pinned to this backboard. I was taped, and oh my gosh, my bony bottom hurt so bad. It hurt from that moment till I got it off hours later. And so I was put in this ambulance, and we were going along for a minute or several minutes, and all of a sudden they said, "We got to stop." And I thought, "For me?" They said, "No, no, there's been a wreck on the side of the road." And they said, "There's a patient there. We need to help. We need to stop and pick up." So in comes this guy. He must have been 6'6" or something. He was hanging off both ends. They brought him in. He was not awake, not responsive. And they were all hovering over me. I said, "I'm fine. Y'all don't worry. Let's take care of this young man." Because I thought, I'm not being a nurse here. I wanted to be a nurse at that point. And so I looked over, and after a while, he was laying there. He wasn't responsive. And I said, "I'm okay. Let's check him." So they did whatever they needed to do. And then after we were gone for a while, I looked again after we were back on the road. Everybody was in their seat. And I said, "Y'all don't need to check me." I said, "You need to check him. He's not breathing very fast." He was breathing, I can't remember, less than 8 or less than 6. And I said, he need to have the ambu bag and bag him or something. They were all looking at me like, what in the heck? I don't ever tell anybody I'm a nurse, but it drove me insane. So We get there, and the doctor comes in and apologizes, said, I have this other patient. I said, take care of him. I'm fine. He was apologizing. So he comes in, finally, he gets him stabilized. And we'll never know about him, but I think about him all the time, this young man. So I was there, and the doctor said, oh, he told me his name. It's quite nice. He said, I'm going to put a nasogastric tube down. You vomited. You vomited blood. I said, no, no, I didn't vomit blood. I said, oh, I had red Kool-Aid. We literally had red Kool-Aid that I threw up. I said, no. And then I looked, and something was dripping out of my nose. It was clear liquid. And I thought, clear liquid out of the nose, blunt trauma. Oh my gosh, do I have a basilar skull fracture? And it's the skull fracture at the base of the skull. And so I said, no, no, you can't put an NG tube down. And he said, why not? And I said, it'll go through the crib form plate to my brain. And he looked at me and said, how did you know that? And I said, how did you not? I said, moving along. So anyway, I did fine. He didn't put the tube down. I was in the hospital for about 3 days. My vital signs looked good. And, you know, most patients, depending on the trauma and that, do okay. They do fine. And so I get back home, and I go right back to work. But I looked horrid. I had these black eyes, and people kind of looked and looked away. And I was getting on the elevator, and this older ER doc, who I knew his family, his wife, his children, he saw me and he said, Karen, are you okay? He kind of gave me one of those. I said, yes. And about that time, I looked down, and I had cerebral spinal fluid dripping out of my nose. And he said, you have a basilar skull. I said, I know. We call it basilar skull. I said, I know. He said, why are you here? I said, because I came back to work. He said, what happened to you? I was embarrassed. I said, I was in a plane crash. He said, a plane crash. So he said, let's give you some antibiotics. You know, you need to go on home. Well, I went to see patients, you know, and they must have thought this one. So the moral of the story is this for me. This Beechcraft Bonanza they don't make anymore. The moral for me is this. Number one, don't go to lunch and stay 3 days. Number two, I thought to myself, I could be home baking cookies. But then later I thought, cookies? I could be drinking Prosecco and having a hot bath. That's what I need to do. That's more the ticket. And number three, I appreciated life more than I ever did. When I get up every day, I say, thank you, God, because it was only an act of God that saved me. And I appreciate life. I look at it different, and I say, what the heck, you know? But now I have to kind of behave. You know, I'm on this good girl regime. Not, but we can only live in hope. So that's my story. Click the like button, the follow button, and subscribe on www.